Before the world speaks, something is already fighting for control of your day. You wake up tired, distracted, uneasy, and you can't explain why. It's not the schedule. It's not the workload. It's what's been quietly draining you before the sun even rises. Worry, regret, fear, and noise have learned how to enter early, stealing peace before you stand up. But what if this morning could be different? What if you could cut off what weakens you, reclaim your strength, and rise with clarity instead of chaos? This message exposes the hidden battle of the morning, and shows how one decision can change the entire direction of your life. The day begins quietly, almost deceptively calm, but beneath the surface something is already wrong. Before the sun fully rises and before the world officially wakes, an invisible battle has already begun. Many awaken not with strength, but with heaviness, an unexplained fatigue that settles in the chest and clouds the mind. Though the room is still and the sky remains dim, peace has already been disturbed. This early hour disturbance does not announce itself loudly. It slips in silently, stealing clarity before the first step of the day is taken. Reports from countless daily routines reveal a pattern that repeats itself every morning. The mind, still half asleep, becomes the first point of attack. Worry about unfinished tasks, fear of what might go wrong, and regret over yesterday's mistakes begin to replay like breaking headlines inside the soul. These thoughts arrive uninvited, yet they are treated as familiar guests. Without resistance, they drain emotional energy, weakening focus before the body even leaves the bed. Experts in spiritual discipline describe these moments as spiritual leaks, small, overlooked habits that quietly siphon strength. Reaching for a phone before prayer, revisiting painful memories, or mentally rehearsing problems instead of hope all contribute to the loss. These actions may seem harmless, but together they form a steady outflow of peace. By the time shoes touch the floor, many have already lost the internal stability needed to face the day. Fear is another dominant presence in the early hours. It disguises itself as preparation, convincing people that constant anxiety is necessary to survive the coming hours. Yet this fear does not protect, it paralyzes. It tightens the chest, shortens patience, and clouds judgment. What should be a moment of renewal becomes a continuation of yesterday's stress, carried forward without pause or healing. Regret also emerges as a powerful thief. Memories of missed opportunities, harsh words spoken, or choices undone surface without warning. These reflections do not bring correction. They bring condemnation. Instead of learning and moving forward, the mind becomes trapped in rewind, draining confidence and replacing hope with self-blame. The morning, meant to offer mercy and new beginnings, becomes overshadowed by yesterday's shadows. As the world prepares to start its engines, many individuals are already depleted, unaware of what has been taken from them. The loss is subtle but significant. Peace reduced, strength weakened, focus scattered. These silent thieves do not need chaos to succeed. They thrive in neglect and unguarded moments. And unless exposed, they will return every morning, stealing from the day before it ever truly begins. As the morning advances from quiet disturbance into full awareness, a clearer picture begins to emerge. Following the silent theft exposed in the previous chapter, this report now reveals a deeper issue. Many are not just drained, they are overloaded. The heaviness felt upon waking is not accidental, nor is it entirely self-created. It is the result of accumulated weight, carried day after day, that was never meant to remain on the human spirit. Investigations into daily emotional patterns show that people often wake up already burdened by responsibilities that have not yet occurred. Conversations not yet spoken, conflicts not yet faced, and outcomes not yet decided are already being carried as certainties. This premature pressure adds strain before the day has even begun, intensifying the exhaustion first detected in the early morning hours. Further analysis reveals that much of this weight originates from expectations imposed by others. Family demands, workplace pressures, social comparisons, and unspoken obligations quietly attach themselves to the mind. Over time, these expectations are no longer questioned. They are accepted as personal duty. The result is a silent agreement to carry loads that were never assigned, draining strength without producing purpose. Emotional residue from the past also contributes significantly to this growing burden. Unresolved guilt, lingering shame, and unhealed disappointment continue to surface with each new day. Rather than being processed and released, these emotions are stored and transported forward, turning every morning into a continuation of yesterday's pain. What should be a fresh start becomes a repeated struggle. Spiritual observers note that this condition often goes unnoticed because it feels normal. Carrying emotional weight has become routine, even expected. Many believe that feeling heavy is simply part of being responsible, mature, or productive. Yet this normalization masks the truth. Constant heaviness is not a sign of strength, it is a warning signal. The weight also affects decision-making early in the day. When the mind is overloaded, clarity disappears. Small choices feel overwhelming, patience shortens, and confidence weakens. This creates a cycle where drained mornings lead to reactive days, reinforcing the sense of failure that will be carried into the next morning. Reports further indicate that people rarely stop to question the origin of their burdens. Instead of asking, "Is this mine to carry?" they assume ownership by default. This unexamined acceptance allows unnecessary pressure to settle deeper, embedding itself into identity and routine. Over time, individuals confuse obligation with purpose. The consequences of this unchecked weight extend beyond emotional fatigue. Physical exhaustion, spiritual numbness, and relational strain often follow. When the soul is weighed down, the body responds, and when clarity is lost internally, external chaos feels inevitable. The morning, intended as a foundation for the day, becomes unstable ground. Despite the seriousness of this condition, this chapter also signals the beginning of awareness. Recognition is the first disruption of the cycle. The moment someone realizes that not every burden belongs to them, a crack appears in the weight. Awareness begins to loosen what habit has tightened. One truth stands clear. The draining of the morning is not only caused by what is taken, but also by what is unnecessarily carried. Until these hidden weights are identified and questioned, the silent thieves exposed earlier will continue to find easy access. The next chapter will reveal the true cost of remaining connected to what weakens the soul, and why release can no longer be delayed. As the investigation continues, a troubling reality comes into focus. After uncovering the silent theft of peace and the hidden weight carried into each morning, this chapter examines why the drain persists. The evidence points to one central issue: connection. Many remain tied, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, to sources that steadily weaken them, even while knowing the cost is rising. Reports indicate that these connections often appear harmless at first. Certain routines, conversations, habits, and thought patterns are woven into daily life so deeply that they are no longer questioned. Yet these ties act like open channels, allowing exhaustion, negativity, and fear to flow freely. What was once familiar has quietly become destructive. One of the most damaging connections is to draining relationships. Repeated exposure to criticism, manipulation, or constant emotional demand erodes inner strength. Morning peace is lost not because of the coming day, but because the mind anticipates the same draining interactions. The body wakes up already bracing for impact, preparing for battles that should never have been normal. Equally costly is the connection to destructive routines. Endless scrolling, immediate exposure to bad news, or reactive communication habits flood the mind before it has time to stabilize. These patterns may feel like simple morning behaviors, but their cumulative effect is severe. Focus fractures, anxiety spikes, and spiritual awareness fades before the day officially begins. Thought patterns themselves are also under scrutiny. Persistent self-doubt, negative self-talk, and rehearsed failure scenarios create internal alliances with weakness. By staying mentally connected to these patterns, individuals unknowingly reinforce the very conditions draining their strength. What the mind repeatedly agrees with, the soul begins to accept as truth. The cost of these connections is not immediate collapse, but gradual erosion. Clarity dulls over time. Motivation weakens. Purpose feels distant. Many report feeling busy yet unproductive, occupied yet unfulfilled. This slow deterioration is dangerous precisely because it feels survivable, until it isn't. Spiritual analysts warn that staying connected to what weakens you also compromises authority. When energy is constantly leaking, there is little strength left to resist new pressures. Boundaries blur. Discernment fades. The morning, which should establish control over the day, instead becomes a surrender to whatever demands attention first. Further findings reveal a cycle at work. The more drained someone becomes, the harder it feels to disconnect. Fatigue convinces the mind that change requires too much effort. This illusion keeps people locked into patterns that continue to consume them, reinforcing the belief that exhaustion is unavoidable. Yet the most alarming discovery is how normalized this condition has become. Many no longer expect mornings to bring peace or clarity. They anticipate struggle as routine. This expectation alone deepens the drain, allowing weakening connections to remain unchallenged and unquestioned. One truth becomes unavoidable. What remains connected will continue to draw power. The cost of staying tied to what weakens the soul is no longer theoretical. It is measurable, daily, and compounding. With this reality exposed, the next chapter will confront the moment of decision. The courage required to cut off what drains and reclaim the morning before it is lost again. Following the exposure of draining connections and their escalating cost, this chapter marks a decisive shift in the narrative. The investigation no longer focuses on what is being lost, but on what must be done. Awareness alone is no longer enough. The evidence is clear. Without deliberate separation, the cycle of depletion will continue uninterrupted, stealing strength from every new morning. Cutting off what drains is not a passive decision. It is an act of courage. Reports show that many hesitate at this stage, not because they doubt the harm, but because they fear the consequences of change. Letting go of familiar patterns, relationships, or habits feels risky. Yet the greater danger lies in remaining connected. The morning cannot be restored while the drain remains open. Experts emphasize that separation does not always look dramatic on the outside, but it is profound on the inside. It begins with boundaries, choosing silence over noise, prayer over panic, and intention over impulse. These choices interrupt the flow of exhaustion and signal a reclaiming of control. The moment of decision, though quiet, carries significant power. Emotionally, this chapter reveals resistance. The mind often protests, insisting that cutting off will cause loss, isolation, or conflict. However, findings suggest the opposite. When draining influences are removed, space is created for clarity and peace to return. What felt like sacrifice becomes survival, and survival soon turns into strength. Spiritually, cutting off is framed not as rejection, but alignment. Separation from what weakens is an act of obedience to what restores. Analysts describe this as a realignment of authority, where the individual stops reacting to pressure and begins responding with purpose. The morning shifts from defensive to deliberate. There is also a moment of discomfort that cannot be ignored. Severing connections exposes silence, and silence can feel unsettling at first. Without familiar noise, unresolved emotions may surface. Yet this exposure is part of healing. The quiet becomes a place of renewal rather than emptiness. Reports indicate that those who take this step experience an immediate, though subtle, shift. Breathing becomes easier. Focus sharpens. The constant internal tension loosens its grip. While external circumstances may remain unchanged, the internal posture is transformed. Strength begins to return where exhaustion once dominated. Importantly, this chapter clarifies that cutting off is not cruelty or selfishness. It is stewardship. Protecting the morning is protecting the entire day. When energy is guarded early, decisions improve, reactions soften, and resilience increases. What is preserved in the morning multiplies throughout the day. The courage to cut it off also sets a precedent. Once separation is practiced in the morning, it becomes easier to maintain throughout the day. Boundaries strengthen. Discernment grows. The individual becomes less vulnerable to sudden drains and unexpected pressure. The tone shifts from exposure to empowerment. The drain has been identified, confronted, and interrupted. Yet cutting off is not the final goal. It is the gateway. With the connection broken, something new is ready to emerge. The next chapter will report on what happens when obedience releases power and the morning is finally restored. With the draining connections now severed, this chapter documents the immediate and unfolding impact of that decision. What follows the act of cutting off is not emptiness, but release. Reports confirm that obedience, choosing separation despite discomfort, triggers a powerful exchange. Where energy once leaked away, strength begins to flow back in. Early observations show a noticeable shift in the inner atmosphere of the morning. The heaviness that once pressed down upon waking begins to lift. Breathing feels deeper, thoughts slow down, and the mind gains room to focus. This is not coincidence. It is the direct result of alignment. When the drain is closed, restoration begins almost instantly. Spiritual analysts describe this moment as a transfer of authority. Obedience repositions the individual from reaction to command. Instead of responding to pressure, the person now sets the tone for the day. The morning no longer dictates weakness, it becomes a platform for strength. This internal shift is subtle but deeply transformative. Emotionally, this release brings relief that many did not realize they were missing. The constant tension, the background anxiety, the low-grade exhaustion fade into the background. In their place comes clarity. Decisions feel lighter. Emotions stabilize. The day feels possible again, not because circumstances changed, but because the internal drain has been repaired. Further reports highlight the return of peace as one of the most immediate effects. Peace here is not the absence of problems, but the presence of stability. It anchors the mind, allowing individuals to face challenges without being consumed by them. This peace becomes the new baseline, replacing the chaos that once dominated the early hours. Physically, the impact is also observed. Rest feels more effective. Energy levels improve. The body responds to the restoration of the spirit. When mental and spiritual strain decreases, physical endurance increases. The morning becomes a source of renewal rather than depletion. Importantly, emphasizes that the power released is sustained through continued obedience. The decision to cut off is not a one-time act, but a posture. Each morning becomes an opportunity to reaffirm alignment, choosing again what strengthens over what drains. Consistency turns a single act of courage into a lasting transformation. Experts caution, however, that resistance may attempt to return. Old habits and patterns often seek reconnection. Yet the difference now is awareness. Having experienced restoration, individuals are more alert to early signs of leakage. What once went unnoticed is now quickly addressed. As obedience becomes habitual, confidence grows. Trust in discernment strengthens. The individual begins to recognize their capacity to protect their peace. The morning evolves from a vulnerable moment into a stronghold. Guarded, intentional, and empowered. Obedience releases power, and power changes the tone of the day. With restoration underway, the focus now shifts to preservation. We'll report on how to guard this renewed strength before the noise of the world attempts to reclaim it. With power restored through obedience, attention now turns to protection. This chapter investigates what happens next in the morning sequence, when renewed strength must be guarded before external demands attempt to reclaim control. The evidence is clear. Restoration without protection is temporary. What has been rebuilt can be drained again if left unguarded. Early morning analysis shows that the first influences allowed into the mind often determine the emotional direction of the entire day. Noise, urgency, and information rushing quickly once the world awakens. Without intentional boundaries, these forces overwhelm even a restored spirit. Guarding the morning becomes essential, not optional. Experts identify the early moments after restoration as a critical window. During this time, focus must be anchored deliberately. Prayer, stillness, and intention act as protective barriers, filtering what is allowed access. These practices stabilize the mind, ensuring that strength is not immediately exchanged for distraction. Emotionally, guarding the spirit involves awareness rather than withdrawal. It is not about avoiding responsibility, but about controlling exposure. Reports indicate that those who limit early contact with negativity, comparison, or crisis maintain clarity longer. The mind remains steady, resisting the pull of anxiety that once dominated the morning. Spiritually, this chapter highlights the importance of priority. What is given first attention receives the most influence. When the morning begins with alignment rather than reaction, authority is preserved. The individual does not chase the day responds to the foundation already set. Further findings reveal that unguarded mornings often collapse under sudden pressure. One message, one demand, or one piece of bad news can unravel hours of progress. Guarding the spirit creates resilience, allowing individuals to absorb information without internal collapse. Strength remains intact even when circumstances shift. The practice of guarding also sharpens discernment. Over time, individuals become skilled at recognizing what drains and what restores. Decisions about attention become quicker and more confident. This discernment acts as an internal security system, protecting peace without constant effort. Resistance, however, does not disappear. The world competes aggressively for attention, particularly in the early hours. Notifications, expectations, and emergencies all demand immediate response. This chapter emphasizes that guarding requires intentional delay. Not everything deserves instant access. Reports show that those who successfully guard their spirit experience a sustained sense of control throughout the day. Stress still exists, but it no longer dominates. Emotional reactions soften, and focus remains directed. The morning's protection continues to yield benefits long after the sun is fully risen. One conclusion stands firm. Restoration must be defended. Strength without boundaries is vulnerable, but strength with protection becomes enduring. With the spirit now guarded, the narrative moves toward transformation. The next chapter will report on what it means to rise not with anxiety, but with authority. With the spirit guarded and the morning secured, a new pattern begins to emerge. This chapter documents a noticeable shift in posture, from defense to command. Those who once woke up bracing for pressure now rise with clarity and confidence. Anxiety no longer sets the agenda. Authority does. The morning becomes a position of strength rather than vulnerability. Reports indicate that this authority is not loud or aggressive. It is calm, steady, and grounded. Decisions are made without panic. Responses replace reactions. Where anxiety once rushed the mind forward into imagined crises, authority keeps the focus anchored in the present. The individual no longer fears the day. They lead it. Emotionally, this transition is profound. Anxiety thrives on uncertainty and lack of control, but authority restores both. The mind feels ordered rather than scattered. Confidence replaces hesitation. Challenges are acknowledged without being magnified. The emotional chaos that once defined the early hours loses its grip. Spiritual observers note that authority is the natural result of alignment and obedience. It is not self-generated confidence, but borrowed strength, drawn from discipline, clarity, and trust. When the morning is guarded, authority flows naturally. The individual stands rooted, unshaken by external turbulence. Further analysis reveals how this shift affects interactions throughout the day. Communication becomes clearer. Boundaries are upheld without guilt. Pressure from others no longer dictates behavior. The authority established in the morning carries forward, influencing every encounter with calm assurance. Anxiety once thrived on anticipation of loss. Fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of falling behind. Authority, however, operates from security. Reports show that individuals begin to approach tasks with purpose rather than urgency. Productivity increases, not through stress, but through focus. Physically, the effects are also evident. Tension in the body eases. Breathing steadies. Energy is conserved instead of wasted on worry. The body responds to the mind's stability, reinforcing the sense of control that defines this new way of rising. Also addresses resistance that may attempt to reintroduce anxiety. Old triggers, unexpected events, and familiar pressures still appear. The difference now is response. Authority does not deny difficulty. It refuses to surrender to it. Stability remains intact even when circumstances shift suddenly. Reports emphasize that authority grows through consistency. Each morning of guarded alignment strengthens confidence. Over time, anxiety loses its credibility. What once felt overwhelming becomes manageable. The individual learns to trust the foundation they have built. The transformation is undeniable. The morning no longer begins in survival mode, but in leadership. With authority established and anxiety diminished, we'll report on the ultimate outcome, stepping forward light, focused, and free into the day ahead. With authority now established and anxiety no longer dictating the tone of the morning, this final chapter reports on the outcome of the entire progression. What began as a day quietly sabotaged by unseen forces has transformed into a deliberate forward movement. Those who once rose burdened now step forward unencumbered, carrying clarity instead of weight. Early observations confirm a striking contrast to the opening chapter. The morning no longer begins with loss, but with intention. Peace is not something to be chased later in the day. It is already present. Strength is not borrowed from adrenaline or pressure, but sustained from alignment. The internal shift is undeniable and lasting. Emotionally, individuals report a sense of lightness that had long been absent. This is not the absence of responsibility, but the removal of unnecessary burden. Regret no longer follows into the day. Fear no longer leads decision-making. Distraction loses its power when focus has been reclaimed at the source. Focus itself emerges as a defining feature of this transformation. Attention is no longer fragmented by competing demands. Priorities feel clearer. Time feels more manageable. The mind, once scattered in the early hours, now operates with precision. Each task is approached with presence rather than pressure. Spiritually, this forward movement reflects freedom. Freedom is no longer misunderstood as escape, but experienced as alignment. By cutting off what drained, guarding what was restored, and rising with authority, the individual now walks in direction rather than confusion. The day unfolds with purpose instead of reaction. Reports also indicate a ripple effect beyond the morning. Interactions improve. Stressful situations lose their dominance. Setbacks are faced without collapse. The freedom established early carries into every environment, proving that the morning truly sets the tone for everything that follows. Importantly, this chapter highlights sustainability. This freedom is not emotional hype or temporary motivation. It is the result of structure, discipline, and awareness practiced consistently. The cycle that once drained the morning has been replaced with one that replenishes it daily. Challenges still arise, but they no longer define the day. Pressure may knock, but it does not enter uninvited. The individual moves forward grounded, not hurried, confident, not reckless. What once overwhelmed now informs without controlling. Analysts conclude that this transformation is not reserved for a select few. It is accessible to anyone willing to confront the silent thieves, question the weight they carry, sever draining connections, and protect what is restored. The process is demanding, but the outcome is decisive. The report is clear. The day no longer begins in deficit. It begins in strength. Light replaces heaviness, focus overcomes distraction, and freedom becomes the defining posture. What once drained the morning has been cut off, and the path forward is now open. After stepping forward light, focused, and free, a deeper transformation begins to surface. This chapter reports on what happens after freedom is experienced, when the morning is no longer just reclaimed once, but redefined permanently. What emerges is a new covenant with the day itself. The morning is no longer treated as routine time, but as sacred ground that must be honored, protected, and renewed daily. Evidence shows that those who have reached this stage no longer ask how to survive the morning, but how to steward it. The mindset shifts from relief to responsibility. Freedom is not taken for granted. It is maintained through intention. The individual understands that every morning now carries weight. Not the weight of burden, but the weight of opportunity. This chapter reveals that consistency becomes the new battleground. After victory, complacency attempts to enter quietly. Old habits try to return under the disguise of comfort. But unlike before, awareness is sharp. The individual recognizes that what once drained cannot be allowed to reattach. The morning covenant demands vigilance. Spiritually, this covenant is marked by devotion rather than desperation. Prayer is no longer a reaction to stress, but a declaration of alignment. Silence is no longer awkward, but welcomed. The morning becomes a place of reinforcement, where authority is renewed and direction is reaffirmed before the world makes its demands. Emotionally, this stage brings maturity. Feelings no longer dictate the value of the morning. Even on difficult days, the foundation remains firm. Peace is no longer dependent on circumstances. This stability proves that the transformation has gone beyond emotion and into discipline. Reports also show a noticeable strengthening of identity. The individual no longer defines themselves by exhaustion, busyness, or struggle. A new self-perception emerges, one that sees clarity, strength, and restraint as normal. This identity shift prevents relapse into old cycles. The morning covenant also influences long-term vision. Goals feel clearer. Purpose feels closer. Instead of drifting through days, individuals begin to move with intention across weeks and months. The morning becomes a compass, setting direction rather than merely starting time. Resistance still appears, but it no longer confuses. When pressure rises, the response is grounded. When distractions call, they are evaluated rather than obeyed. The covenant acts as an internal agreement. Nothing enters the morning without permission. Observers note that this stage produces quiet confidence. There is no urgency to prove strength, because strength is already established. The individual moves steadily, rooted in the discipline formed through previous chapters. What was once dramatic chaos has been replaced by controlled momentum. Also confirms that transformation is transferable. Others begin to notice the difference. Calm replaces reactivity. Focus replaces noise. Without words, the morning discipline becomes a testimony. Strength speaks for itself. One truth becomes undeniable. The morning is no longer a vulnerable beginning, but a daily vow. A vow to protect peace, to honor alignment, and to walk forward deliberately. With this covenant established, the story does not end. It stabilizes. What was reclaimed is now sustained, and the morning stands secured for whatever the future brings. With the morning covenant firmly established, this chapter reports on the long-term outcome of a life no longer defined by daily depletion. What once began as a fight for peace at sunrise has now expanded into a sustained way of living. The focus shifts from managing mornings to embodying wholeness. The leaks that once drained strength are no longer temporary issues. They have been permanently addressed. Investigations show that individuals at this stage experience a new level of continuity. There is no sharp divide between morning strength and daytime collapse. The clarity gained at dawn carries through conversations, decisions, and challenges. Life no longer feels like a series of emotional resets, but a steady flow of purpose and control. Emotionally, the absence of constant leakage brings depth. Feelings are still present, but they are no longer overwhelming. Joy is no longer fragile. Peace is no longer situational. Even frustration is processed without spiraling. The inner life stabilizes, proving that the earlier work of cutting off and guarding was not in vain. Spiritually, this chapter highlights endurance. Strength is no longer consumed by every demand. Prayer is no longer limited to mornings, because alignment has become continuous. The individual walks through the day connected upward, not constantly refilling what was lost, but stewarding what is already full. Reports also indicate a shift in how pressure is perceived. Stressful situations still arise, but they are no longer personal threats. Instead of triggering fear or urgency, pressure becomes information. The individual evaluates rather than reacts. This detachment protects energy and preserves focus. Relationships also undergo transformation. Boundaries established in the morning extend naturally into interactions. Draining dynamics lose access. Communication becomes clear and calm. The individual no longer overextends to prove worth or secure approval. Strength removes the need for performance. This chapter reveals that time itself feels different. Days feel longer, not because they are slower, but because energy is no longer wasted. Focus replaces frenzy. Purpose replaces noise. What once felt rushed now feels intentional, even when the schedule is full. Observers note that relapse becomes less likely at this stage. The cost of returning to old patterns is now clearly understood. Exhaustion is no longer romanticized. Chaos is no longer tolerated. The individual protects peace instinctively, without guilt or hesitation. Importantly, this transformation does not isolate. It stabilizes. With leaks sealed, there is more capacity to serve, create, and lead. Strength is shared without being drained. Presence is offered without being depleted. The individual becomes reliable, not because they do more, but because they are whole. The final assessment is clear. A life that no longer leaks does not depend on perfect circumstances. It depends on discipline, awareness, and alignment practiced daily. What began with reclaiming the morning has reshaped the entire life. The drain has been cut off, the foundation secured, and the future now unfolds from strength rather than survival. With a life no longer leaking, this chapter reports on the final and most profound shift. Strength is no longer an achievement, it becomes the standard. What once required constant effort to maintain is now the default posture. The individual no longer wakes up asking whether they will have enough energy, clarity, or peace for the day. These are now assumed, established, and protected. Analysts observe that this stage marks the collapse of the old identity entirely. The person who once identified as tired, overwhelmed, or constantly behind no longer exists. In their place stands someone governed by rhythm rather than reaction. Mornings no longer feel like recovery zones. They feel like launch points. The transformation has moved from behavior into being. Emotionally, this standard brings remarkable stability. Feelings rise and fall, but they no longer dictate direction. Bad days do not erase discipline. Good days do not breed carelessness. The internal system holds firm regardless of external fluctuation. This consistency proves that strength is no longer fragile. It is integrated. Spiritually, this chapter highlights a deepening authority. Alignment is no longer renewed out of fear of loss, but practiced out of conviction. Prayer, focus, and guarding the spirit are no longer tasks, they are instincts. The morning covenant described earlier has matured into a lifestyle agreement that governs every hour. Reports also show a dramatic reduction in internal conflict. Decisions are made faster because values are clear. Boundaries are enforced calmly because guilt has lost its influence. The mind no longer debates what it already knows drains it. Strength simplifies life by eliminating constant negotiation with weakness. Pressure from the outside world continues, but it no longer redefines the inside world. Urgency knocks, but does not rule. Chaos appears, but does not spread. The individual operates from center, not from the edge. This grounded presence changes how challenges are handled, and often how quickly they dissolve. Observers note that others begin to adjust around this new standard. Draining dynamics lose leverage. Unhealthy expectations fall away. The individual is no longer pulled into dysfunction simply by proximity. Strength establishes its own boundaries without explanation or apology. Powerful internal freedom. The freedom from constantly monitoring one's own state. There is no longer a need to ask, "Am I okay?" Because alignment answers first. Energy is directed outward toward purpose, not inward toward damage control. Importantly, this strength does not harden the individual. It refines them. Compassion increases because insecurity has decreased. Presence deepens because distraction has lost its grip. The individual becomes both firm and calm, decisive and patient. This balance marks true authority. The report confirms a final shift in the narrative. The morning is no longer a fight. The day is no longer a drain. Strength is no longer borrowed, rebuilt, or chased. It has become the standard. And from this standard, the individual now moves forward. Not occasionally strong, but consistently grounded, regardless of what the day brings. With strength now established as the standard, this chapter reports on the final expansion of the transformation. Life is no longer lived from survival, but from overflow. What once required constant defense now produces abundance. Energy is no longer rationed carefully to avoid collapse. It flows steadily, fueling purpose, creativity, and service without fear of depletion. Investigations reveal a profound internal shift at this stage. The individual no longer measures the day by how much it takes, but by how much can be given without loss. This is not overextension. It is overflow. Because the leaks have been sealed and strength stabilized, giving no longer threatens collapse. Presence is offered freely, not anxiously. Emotionally, overflow brings generosity of spirit. Patience increases. Compassion deepens. The sharp edges once caused by exhaustion soften. Reactions are replaced by responses rooted in calm awareness. Even conflict is handled without internal chaos, proving that peace has become resilient rather than conditional. Spiritually, this chapter highlights multiplication. What was once restored internally now begins to affect the external environment. The guarded morning does not remain private. It shapes atmospheres. Calm spreads. Order influences chaos. Others experience stability simply by proximity to someone who lives anchored rather than reactive. Reports show that purpose becomes clearer at this stage. Without the constant drain of self-management, attention turns outward. Vision expands beyond the day into long-term impact. The individual begins to ask not just how to live well, but how to live meaningfully. Strength now serves direction. Time itself feels transformed. Hours feel fuller, not rushed. The day no longer slips away unnoticed. Each moment carries intention. Overflow slows the experience of life, allowing depth where there was once haste. Productivity becomes focused, not frantic. Importantly, this chapter confirms that overflow does not mean perfection. Difficult days still come. Pressure still appears. But these no longer define the internal state. Even when circumstances are heavy, the inner reservoir remains intact. Strength is drawn from within, not borrowed from urgency. Observers note that leadership often emerges naturally at this stage. Not formal authority, but embodied influence. Others trust the stability they sense. Words carry weight because they are not fueled by anxiety. Decisions inspire confidence because they arise from alignment, not impulse. This chapter also documents a quiet joy returning to daily life. Not excitement driven by novelty, but contentment rooted in wholeness. The individual no longer needs constant stimulation to feel alive. Peace itself becomes energizing. Stillness becomes productive.